Now welcome to another Let's Talk Some Star Wars, where this time we'll be taking a look at and discussing the results of the poll that asked you to rate or grade the Book of Boba Fett. I'll then of course be comparing it to all the other Disney Plus shows that we've gotten so far, or Star Wars shows, before I then read and respond to some of your comments. And so to get right to it, let's take a look at those results, where we'll see that 7% of people thought it was an amazing show and gave it 5 stars, 44% then said it was good and gave it 4, 34% went with 3 stars, thinking it was pretty average, which left 11% of people to give it 2 stars, thinking it to be not very good, and a final 4% to give it 1 star, thinking it to be terrible. And so when we do all the math here, the Book of Boba Fett ends up with an average score of 3.39, which, when compared to everything else Star Wars that Disney Plus has given us, it sees it finish in last place, though do note I never did a poll for all of Season 7 of Clone Wars, only the Siege of Mandalore arc, so the entire season would have likely finished somewhat lower since that final arc was arguably the best arc, but it probably wouldn't have brought the score down below the Book of Boba Fett, I feel pretty safe in saying. I also never did a poll for Visions, but considering that was a non-canon and intentionally different kind of take on Star Wars, or multiple different takes on Star Wars I should say, I didn't think it would exactly fit on this list anyway. Either way, and probably needless to say, but this isn't or wasn't a very great showing for one of the most popular and beloved characters in all of Star Wars. He finished last compared to everything else done so far. This certainly isn't the score I thought it would end up getting going into the series. I had high hopes for this show, as many no doubt did out there, and for many it didn't quite deliver, I think. And to begin to find out why, let's now move on to your comments, but not before once again just saying thank you to everyone who votes, comments, and watches these videos, or any of my videos. It is all greatly appreciated, as is a big thank you needed for everyone who supports this channel over on Patreon. All that said, let's now begin, as we always do, with the top-rated comment from the poll, which this time came to us from Helleman Anderson, who said, "This show proved to me just how important the right director is. The episodes that weren't done by Robert Rodriguez were absolutely amazing, and aside from a few bits here and there, the ones he did were not very good. This show could have been substantially better with the right directing, but instead I would argue Boba Fett is almost a lesser character now than he was before." And first of all, if you're watching this now, that means a poll for Boba Fett should be up, a new Battle of the Heroes and Villains poll to kind of regrade the character from the first time to see if he has improved or maybe gone down after his series. If you want to partake in that, the link to all my polls will be in the description below. Anyway, I do unfortunately have to agree with you that Rodriguez's directing was a little haphazard is the first word that comes to mind, I guess, and that obviously the right directors, as we can just see in this series and with these different episodes, can make all the difference in the world. There was this lack of cohesion in what he was doing in his episodes, which only added to the problem of there being kind of a lack of cohesion throughout the entire series, and not just because we took 2 episodes away from the main story and brought in the Mandalorian, as well as a bunch of other arguably unneeded, albeit very cool characters. Instead, it was because it never felt like everything just came together or fit together in the end. It certainly didn't end up being greater than the sum of its parts. There were good episodes, there were good moments, there were cool things here and there, and some ideas that had a ton of potential, but it, again, all failed to come together in a way that really left me feeling like, or wanting to say, wow, that was really a good series overall. Instead, I'm left pointing at the parts I liked and saying, you know, that was good, but what could have been if it had all come together just better in the end. Alright, and moving on now, we have this comment from the Brickster, who said, "Definitely felt somewhat lacking. I expected to see a show with all the ins and outs of the underworld. I expected at least a scene of Obadiah to make the Pikes more of intimidating villains, or at least Crimson Dawn to make an appearance. While I absolutely loved the Mando episodes, I feel like those should have waited for his show so that Boba could do more." Speaking of which, why didn't Boba do more? This show seemed to show him as an extremely poor tactician, lackluster fighter, and wishy-washy leader. This was supposed to be about him becoming the galaxy's next big crime lord, or at least that's the vibe I think we all got from that credit scene, that post-credit scene. What did he do, though? Spent half the show chasing one of the biggest crime organizations off Tatooine, instead of making a mutually beneficial deal with them. Then there's also this comment from Emperor Cubone who said, I was fine with the hard pivot to Mando, but then Boba sat out for another whole episode, not uttering a single line in his own planning meeting, and then got maybe half the screen time in his own finale. Don't get me wrong, he looked cool and had some nice moments, but the first half of the Book of Boba Fett overloaded with all the flashbacks, so it really seems like they should have balanced things out a little better. As much as I loved it, maybe leave out some of the Grogu stuff and save that for Mando Season 3. Anyway, at the end of the day, Boba spent the whole show gathering support, not to lead them into battle, but to have them do his heavy lifting, both in story and production. And I don't necessarily have any kind of problem with a hard pivot to Mando for one episode, or maybe just for half of an episode, because the back half of that one, of episode 5, instead of showing Mando fix up his new ship just so we can have a scene at the end of the finale where Grogu is in that little pod and they can fly off into the proverbial sunset, it could have and maybe should have been a little team-up between Din and Boba. Maybe, as the Brickster basically suggested, go to Obadiah to try and negotiate with the Pikes directly with Din as his backup, but eventually it turns into aggressive negotiations and they have to just escape the planet, and this explains why they are going to war finally. But then during this, or before that, maybe we can finally learn why one city on one planet, why Mos Espa on Tatooine, is so important to the Pikes and their spice running. Do they really need this one city in a giant galaxy? And if so, why? Or are they open to negotiations? What is so crucial or important that they'll go to war for this one city? Give us more of a peek at that criminal underworld we all expected. Let us go into the workings of it just a little bit. This also could have been a good time to explain what spice even is to the casual fan or the average viewer. Not that we can't understand it's a drug or that it's not implied to be, but why is it so bad? We don't see one single person in Mos Espa even using it or actually affected by its use or even its sale or transportation. Only the Tuskens seemed to be affected by it, with the train they were carrying, gunning them down for reasons, for sport apparently. I don't know, maybe spice could have been something for the Vespa gang to do and explore. Instead of stealing water, maybe they were selling spice to afford their mods and afford those cool, colorful bikes they had. And then we could have seen some people strung out on the street, dying of thirst because they'd rather buy spice than buy water. Maybe then we could have tried to give them, the mod squad, some sort of arc explaining how they went from rebellious lawbreakers to caring so much about the city that they refused to leave when the attack was coming. I mean, just do something with them other than being unquestionably loyal to Boba Fett because he offered them a job 10 seconds after they were all but mocking him. Because no, the idea that there would be those interested in modding themselves in a galaxy where cyborgs exist is not a terrible idea in and of itself. It's just something they do for the heck of it, though, I guess. Whereas it could have been sold almost as an addiction that they have. They're addicted to getting these mods and upgrading themselves, which they pay for by keeping others addicted to spice. We could have seen a little circle of life here. But I guess Disney and Lucasfilm didn't want to really get too deep into something like that, into the sale of drugs and the impact it can have on a community, on the people who both buy and sell, and everyone else around them. Instead, all that was just something that was left on the outskirts of the story, all this drug use and what was really at the center of it, which was the spice. Something implied or just left for us to assume but never explored to really give this some weight and some meaning for the people of Mos Espa, who were supposedly affected by the spice trade, which was part of the whole problem here. Everything, the story, just kind of felt watered down and like they were unwilling to take it to the darker places they should have with a character like Boba Fett. Which then brings us to this comment from Graves, who said, I think it was pretty bad. I gave it 1 star. We never got to see Boba Fett as a proper crime lord in his crime show, yet we managed to somehow see him as a moralistic mayor by the end. He doesn't do crime, he doesn't run spice, and he's not a competent leader. Fights felt floaty, and I genuinely think this would have been better received as a cartoon. I hope the show doesn't get renewed because this foundation is crippled on a fundamental level. Then there's also this comment from Jacob Renner who said, my main problem was that they didn't commit to making Boba Fett a villain protagonist and made him a mostly purely heroic character, which doesn't fit him really. Boba Fett should be more ruthless and intimidating. Then also this one from Mr. J, who said, "It was a consistently abysmal show that cheapens the character into a sanitized Disney hero. It barely had a coherent plot and added horrific additions to the Star Wars universe in the form of the Inspector Gadget-esque mod culture and the Vespa gang. And to top it all off, the best parts of the show had nothing to do with Boba Fett. I'm honestly being generous when I give it 2 stars." Then next up we have this one from Vicente, who said, "As a huge Boba Fett fan, this series was profoundly underwhelming. I attended the premiere of The Force Awakens dressed in my Boba Fett costume, and the only thing I wanted from the sequels was a hint that Boba was alive. I now realize I just wanted them to not ruin Star Wars, but hey, who would have thought? When I saw Boba on Mando, I cried and that was my peak moment of a Star Wars fan. Everything went downhill from there. I'd rather have kept him as this mysterious character than undo him and redo him in such an uncompelling way. The only thing that I enjoyed from the show was the Tusken episodes, even though Boba had Stockholm Syndrome is another thing that bothers me from the show. I give it a sincere 1. Also then this comment from Tim Sears, who said, "Maybe I'm coming from the ruthless bounty hunter perspective, I don't know. Fett used to be the most feared and respected bounty hunter and willingly worked for the Empire. But we didn't see that character at all in this show. They didn't do enough to sell the change from his old life, largely by pretending his old life didn't exist, except for when some other character started talking about it. Fett was constantly being shown up, outsmarted, rendered helpless, and upstaged. He was completely forgotten about for 3/4 of the last 3 episodes. When he was on screen, Shand was doing all the things we were hoping to see Fett doing, and being the smarter than the king advisor. I have held back my judgment till after the finale, and now I am a solid 2 out of 5. There was some great world building and some really cool scenes and sequences, and while I loved the Mando Season 2.5, I thought it was out of place and really highlighted how meh Fett was executed." Okay, so there were certainly plenty of people who made comments about how this was supposed to show us an older, wiser Boba Fett, and that he had grown beyond who he was before, whatever or whoever he was before. Which is one of my big problems and why this sort of redemption arc falls flat with me, this kind of change in him. Because what is he growing beyond? What is he growing away from? How do we know he was this bad person that needed to change? I mean, we know he's a pretty amazing bounty hunter. It's set up well enough in The Empire Strikes Back that he is a great bounty hunter. But we don't really know anything about him before that or other than that. We don't know that he's anything more than someone who, like a lot of people I'd assume, worked for the Empire sometimes and tracked down targets for them. That might make him not a good guy, but I don't know that means he's some evil dude who now needs a sort of, again, this sort of redemption story. Even if he does, among the fandom and the EU, have a reputation of being this kind of cold-hearted, badass bounty hunter, he doesn't have that in the movies or in the canon that we know about. Which isn't to say you couldn't have enjoyed this change in the character, this growth of the character from what you assume him to be, or what we pretty much all assume him to be. I'm not saying we can't just accept the fact that he was, yes, probably the best bounty hunter in the galaxy, even though we've never technically seen it. But what I think a lot of fans wanted to see was, yes, they wanted to see him be the best bounty hunter in the galaxy. They wanted to see him earn this reputation that we'd all assumed he had. What exactly made him the best in the galaxy? They wanted to know that. They wanted to see that. They wanted to see the greatest bounty hunter of all time acting like a bounty hunter. And there's nothing wrong with being disappointed that we didn't get to see that we didn't get to see what a lot of people just rightfully assumed this show was going to be about. Alright, let's move on to this comment from Steve Assay, who said, "Felt like there were many missed opportunities with this show. Have Cad Bane tell Boba he was the one that killed the Sand People, or actually having a massive army of Sand People rushing to help save the day. Grogu was totally unnecessary for the episode. The episodes directed by Robert Rodriguez were definitely the weakest. I wish I could watch it with the eyes of the people who loved it." And like I always say, if you loved it, that's great, that's fine. And I wish I too had seen it through the eyes of people who are saying this was amazing and that they loved everything about it. I just disagree, I didn't see that. And what I don't get about this series is, why wasn't Cad Bane revealed to be the one who killed the Tuskens? And why wasn't he in the show much, much earlier and set up better overall, set up to be the quote-unquote main villain, and set up the big final battle with Boba Fett much better. These are all some of my biggest questions, and they seem like such obvious things to do that you wonder how they missed them, how they didn't do them. I guess maybe they just really liked the idea and wanted this dramatic entrance for Cad Bane walking out of the desert and then dueling Cobb Vanth, another character that, albeit a character I do like, technically wasn't needed in this series. He wasn't needed if, at some point in the final battle, they had gone to the Tuskens. If Boba had gone to the Tuskens and rallied them, then we don't need the people of Freetown to show up. But if they hadn't gone to Freetown, if they hadn't brought in Cobb Vanth, then they don't get to set up the next series. We don't get that post-credit scene with him in it. And they instead could have, I don't know, maybe just done what was best for the actual series instead of worrying about what comes after. But they never seemed too interested in that, did they? This wasn't about Boba Fett as much as it was a bridge to something else. I think a kind of gap between seasons 2 and 3 of The Mandalorian, which they even told us it was going to be The Mandalorian 2.5, which, yeah, that didn't end up being a bad thing in that respect, but it didn't end up being a good thing in the respect of Boba Fett. And so all in all, this, in my opinion, and you're free to completely disagree with me, but it felt a bit too much like the MCU, which isn't to say I don't enjoy the MCU and the way it does things, and that they can't borrow a little bit from it, that Star Wars can't in some ways be a little like the MCU, I suppose. But I think Star Wars needs to find its own formula. I think it needs to find its own way. And I sure didn't think this was it. I sure don't think the Book of Boba Fett being this kind of hodgepodge of different stories is the way. Though if they want to embrace the idea of doing something anthology style, which I talked about in my other video, then I'm all for them doing that. Just don't give us the illusion of a show about Boba Fett and then don't make it about Boba Fett. Alright, well that's enough rambling out of me. Let's now get to a few final comments, starting with this one from Chris K, which is a bit on the longer side, but got a lot of thumbs up, so let us read it and see what Chris has to say. Frankly, the entire show was a disservice to Boba's character specifically. Aside from the flashbacks which served to fill in the gaps from Return of the Jedi to Mando Season 2, the writing of the entire series made him look like a weakling, both mentally and physically. There's no excuse for him to not even use his jetpack during combat throughout the series except for that cringe-worthy speeder chase and the final episode. There's also no excuse for Black Chrysanthemum to casually just walk into Boba's palace and chambers with Boba obviously having no security measures, all while Boba is supposed to be an extremely intelligent and calculated bounty hunter that has a deep knowledge of the crime families and their methodology, given his history of working for them for decades. Boba in the original trilogy, as you have mentioned prior, was portrayed as an extremely calculated and intelligent bounty hunter that was at the peak of his profession. Vader even respected him and knew of his reputation. Here he was outsmarted by virtually every foe. It is painful to see Boba reduced to this level. I love Morrison as Boba, but I am extremely disappointed in how Boba was reduced to a poorly written, back-to-tank relying character that had Fennec steal his thunder in virtually every combat scene, except in the last episode. It just seems like Boba in this series is a far cry from the portrayal he had of him and the mystique he had in Mando Season 2. Boba deserves much better. P.S. The excuse that Boba was injured, which is why he needed the back-to-tank and relied on Fennec in the first episode, does not make any sense, given that he was far more impressive, powerful, capable, mysterious, and intelligent in Mando Season 2, all while not feeling the need to tell everyone his name is Boba Fett. Alright, great comment, Chris, and thank you for taking the time to leave it, and also thank you to Kevin Eccles, who wrote a rather long comment himself, one I'm not going to read this time, but do feel free to pause it and read it for yourself. Alright, and moving on now, we have this comment from Lego Yoda, who said, as a miscellaneous bag of Star Wars content, I'd give it 4 stars, but as a Boba Fett show, it has to get a 2 from me. Then there's this one from Life After Phasma, who said, it was a strangely made show, and I'm glad it happened for the Mando Grogu side plot, but it did leave something wanting at the end. If there was trouble behind the scenes, this may be all the evidence of it, and we'll never hear anything more about it ever again. Moving on then, we also have this comment from Justin Kowaliski, who said, honestly, I think the story had a lot of subtle narrative choices that many overlooked. This is a character well into middle life. He is not a spry young bounty hunter anymore. He is at an age that most people begin to look inward and reflect upon their lives. I believe the show did an amazing job of showing a badass fighter like Boba Fett becoming more of a leader and less of a lone wolf. The story could have definitely had or used some tightening as well as less crossover with The Mandalorian, but overall I think the story was done pretty well. Definitely a good show. Next up here we have this comment from Joseph Aaron who said, I wanted to enjoy the crap out of this show based on all the badass things I've heard relating to Boba Fett's history of being one of, if not the goats of bounty hunting in Star Wars, only to have to watch him mainly walk and talk with the helmet off and not even involved in 1/3 of the show. Fun elements in the show, but overall underwhelmed. C at best for me. Then also we have this one from Fett1313 who said, I give it 2 stars. This show had some great Star Wars moments, but ultimately it felt like it was made by people who had no interest in making a show about Boba Fett. I really wish Boba had been treated with a bit more respect. You can feel that the people behind The Mandalorian care about the story they are telling, and that care is lacking for everything or anything related to Boba in this show. There were a lot of great and enjoyable moments, but I feel like the reputation of Boba was hurt. Next up, this comment from Connor Ryan who said, 4 stars. I think it needed a few more episodes. It started with a decent slow burn, had a cool off-topic back half, and then a very, very cool but quick finale. I like the direction they've taken for the character. I've liked some of the action. I've liked the side characters and the setting, but there is some pacing, tonal, and writing issues that are obvious. I'm excited to see where we go with Boba from here. Then there's also this one from Blob Snail who said, would have benefited from taking more time to establish the Pike plotline instead of spending 1 3/4 episodes focusing on unnecessary setup for Mando Season 3. While episode 5 and 6 were great, they completely derailed the story. And also then this one from Sarmad Habib Khan who said, I'd probably give it a 3.5. That ending really brought the show down in my eyes, and I like that Grogu came back to Din, but it completely undid that brilliant Mandalorian Season 2 ending. And finally here we have this comment from Jack the Menace who said, the show was really a wave of ups and downs, with some emotional beats hitting and others definitely not. The later episodes felt like a downgrade, though the episodes are still fine in my opinion. It's just the Tusken deaths being rushed, Mando taking over 2 entire episodes, and the extreme plot armor of the final episode for the heroes that bring it down. Though there are still great things for the series. The Easter eggs, references, and exploring Tusken culture was fascinating, and I hope they do more, possibly with Boba uniting the different tribes. 6.5 out of 10. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you thought of the Book of Boba Fett, or tell me what you thought of what I or anyone else had to say about the Book of Boba Fett, or go ahead and vote and comment on the poll about the character Boba Fett. Whatever the case may be, leave a comment somewhere and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.